Hi everyone, thank you very much to the Current Archaeology Live team for inviting me to talk today. I'm going to be focusing on some of my recent PhD research, which has been looking at the monument of Mount Pleasant in Dorset, in Dorchester, and talking a bit about monument complexes and the Dorchester complex in general. My PhD is looking at monument complexes, which are clusters of, in my case, Neolithic monuments that are built again and again in the same time in the same place. There are lots and lots of these complexes across Britain and Ireland, some of them very, very famous, like the area around Stonehenge, others not quite so well known, and it's one of those less well-known ones that we'll be looking at today. This is the location of Dorchester, just down here, not far from the south coast, and that's the complex we'll be exploring. So just to give you a bit of a chronological tour of the complex, it sits within the confluence of two rivers, the Froom to the north and the South Winterbourne to the south. And all of the monuments are built in this sort of triangular area between the two rivers. Here you can see the stars are settlement evidence, so things like pits with early Neolithic pottery in. And the early Neolithic monuments in the area are perhaps most famously the one at Maiden Castle, not the famous Iron Age hill fort, but actually underneath that is an early Neolithic causewayed enclosure, two concentric banks and ditches. And then later a bank barrow, a very long linear mound, is built over the top of them. So that's quite a major monument here in the early Neolithic. We also have a few long barrows, and we have a slightly strange monument called Allington Avenue, which is two parallel ditches 75 metres long. It could be a long barrow, although there was no trace of a mound or any burials, or it could be a sort of long enclosure or perhaps a short cursus monument, but again, built in the early Neolithic period. In the Middle Neolithic, moving forward in time, we have the flagstones enclosure, which is built, but not much else. That seems to be the only thing that's really happening. The flagstones enclosure is a circular ditched enclosure built sort of segmented or intercutting pits, about 100 metres in diameter. And it was used for burial. There are a number of cremations from this site, both from within the enclosure and from the ditch itself, and a number of burials of children as well in the ditch. It's very similar to the earliest phase of Stonehenge, and it's a type of monument we call a proto-henge. There are a few of these across the country. There are some up in North Wales, and it's built around about 3000 BC and used for burial, but possibly other things as well. It's not really until the late Neolithic that we get a bit of an explosion of monument construction happening in the Dorchester area. We have firstly this quite enormous henge called Mulberry Rings, which still stands today. You can visit it. An unusual henge. It was a large bank and then a ditch, but dug from the bottom of the ditch down were about 45 incredibly deep shafts, 7-8 metres deep, into which were placed all kinds of deposits, antler picks, carved chalk objects, animal bones. Slightly strange monument, excavated in 1905 by Harold St George Gray. We have Greyhound Yard, which is a really large timber palisaded enclosure. When excavated, what the archaeologists have found are the post holes and the ramps which were used to erect these large timber posts. And only little bits of it have been found during development works that have happened in Dorchester's town centre. This is part of the site that was excavated underneath where the Waitrose now is in the middle of the town. But again, a really massive enclosure, sort of surrounding a dry valley that drops down to the river. And finally, we have Mount Pleasant, which is the monument we'll be looking at today. It sort of encloses a ridge, which is right at the end of the ridge overlooking the two rivers. So Mount Pleasant is a monument that is made up of a number of different components. There is the outer bank and ditch, the henge itself, enormous. I mean, the ditch is about 2.5 metres deep. The banks are up to 4 metres high. The banks are about 18 metres wide, so really chunky. This is a big, big monument, a mega-henge. Within that, you have a timber circuit, again with standing posts, a bit like the one I just showed you at Greyhound Yard. Although in this case, the posts were set into a continuous trench, a palisade trench. At the entrances, of which two have been found, to the north and to the east, the entrances were flanked with enormous big tree trunks, huge timber posts. All of this is probably oak. And representing round about 1,600 posts in total. So again, a massive, massive monument. And within that, the highest part of the site in the centre, it is a concentric timber monument, romantically known as Site 4, arranged around almost like 4 aisles, like the spokes of a wheel. This timber structure, it's a little bit like Woodhenge and some of the other timber monuments of this date that you might be more familiar with. It's timber, but there are also some standing stones as part of this. In the middle, there's a sort of cove arrangement of stones, and there are a few standing stones at the ends of each of the aisles as well. And that Site 4 was surrounded by its own ditch. On the western side of the monument is a mound known as Concobarrow, which seems to have been built on top of the Henge bank. It's a large monumental mound. And on the eastern side is something that's been identified through aerial photography, which is a sort of what looks like a holloway or an entrance roadway linking this monument to the river. So if anyone knows much about Megahenges elsewhere, the links to rivers seem to be quite important. So how do we know all this? This is a site that was excavated in 1970 and 1971 by Jeff Wainwright and his team. This was a time that Jeff was investigating a number of these Megahenges in southern Britain. He was excavating at Durrington Walls and also at Marden in the Vale of Pewsey. And so this was a sort of research set of questions that he was targeting, but also looking at how much this monument had been damaged and how much survived, because the site was under the plough and still is today. This is an excavation photograph showing that Site 4 in the middle of the site. So you can see the scale here. That looked quite a small component of the monument, didn't it, in the previous plan? But it's actually a really large, very impressive monument. This is an aerial photograph showing the site from the air in 1996. You can see that the features of the monument show really well here. The chalk banks are visible as a white spread in the foreground. You can see the ditch just within that, and then you can see the thin lines, which are the palisade. Now, Jeff's excavations were very thorough. They found all kinds of evidence for how the site had been used. Lots of animal bones, lots of grooved-ware pottery. It was obviously a site that was occupied and used as a gathering place. Lots of objects sort of stuck in and around the post holes of Site 4. And signs of sort of feasting and mass occupation at certain dates, although not any evidence for structures or houses like we now know exist at Durrington Walls. It's quite possible that this site was some sort of settlement, but the evidence hasn't been found yet, and I suspect because of the plough damage it may well have been lost, which is a bit of a shame. When Jeff excavated this site, he thought that the main henge was a Neolithic monument, and he thought that the timber palisade inside was an early Bronze Age addition to the monument. So quite a long chronology over which this site had developed. This was based partly on radiocarbon dates. He submitted quite a few samples at the time of his excavation report, but also based on parallels with sites elsewhere. So as part of my PhD, I selected this site and the Dorchester complex more generally as a good set of sites to target for new radiocarbon dating. I was trying to build up much more precise chronologies for these complexes to try and piece together how they had emerged and developed over time. So the first step was to go to the archive. This is the stores of Dorset County Museum, which is where all of the material from Jeff's excavations are kept. Some of them still in their original boxes, as you can see from that address label, addressed to Jeff Wainwright at the Mount Pleasant Excavations. The initial visit here was a bit disappointing. The animal bones from the site had all been, at some point in the past, mixed up. So they were not with their original context information. And you have to have really, really good, reliable context information in order to do the radiocarbon dating and the sample selection that was needed. However, there were lots of antler picks, and there were lots of charred plant remains and charcoal, and some human bones from later burials in the ditch, all of which were suitable for radiocarbon dating. So with the help of Dr. Peter Marshall, who has been of great help helping sample selection, taking samples, advising on how to send everything off and how to analyse it when it came back, here he is in the stores taking a sample from one of the antler picks. And this is a typical artefact that we chose. We were deliberately selecting antler picks that came from the very bottom of the ditches, the primary levels of the ditches, and ones that had clear evidence for use. So wear and modifications to show that they've been used as picks. And this gives us a really relatively reliable indication that these have been used to excavate the ditches. And so dating them gives us a really good indication of when those were constructed. So only very small samples are taken of this material, 3 or 4 grams, and sent off to laboratories around the country and beyond to get the radiocarbon dates back. These ones were sent to Oxford and Zurich and Glasgow and Belfast. So they were all dispersed around the country and beyond, and then obviously the dates come back. And then we go through a process of analysis of those dates, combining the information that's come back from the laboratories with the archaeological information that we know from the stratigraphy of the site, from the records that Jeff published about where everything had been found, in order to model the chronology for the site. And this provides a bit of an overview of what we found. What it showed is that the first thing to be constructed was the henge bank and ditch itself. And that was the first major monumental activity on the site. It's quite possible that the ridge top had been occupied prior to this. We have got some bits of groove wear from underneath the bank, for example. And if it's anything like Darrington Walls, where you've got a sort of settlement and occupation beforehand, maybe this was a site that was heavily and intensively occupied. But the first major monumental work was the construction of the henge bank and ditch round about the middle of the 26th century BC, so about 2500 BC. Shortly after that, so perhaps the children or the grandchildren of the people who dug out that henge bank decided to build the palisaded enclosure within it. So relatively shortly afterwards. And the construction of that palisaded enclosure actually restricted movement and access into the middle of the site. There are entrances to the north and to the east, but some of the other original entrances into the earthwork henge seem to have been not replicated in the inner enclosure. So that suggests that there's more restriction as to movement and access into the middle. Around about the same time as that palisaded enclosure was built, the conker barrow was probably constructed on the henge bank. It's slightly difficult to know that because we've only got one suitable sample from the conker barrow ditch, but it seems to be about the same time, and that would make sense perhaps if you're restricting access, both visual and physical, into the middle of the enclosure. The building of that big mound on the bank may be something to do with providing visual access. Some people might have been allowed up there to watch what was going on, perhaps, or perhaps it's more to do with a general kind of monumentalizing of this structure even further, making it a really visible feature in the landscape. The final activity, construction activity, was the building of the Site 4 ditch, so surrounding that timber structure in the middle. We don't have any direct dates for the timber structure itself. Unfortunately, there wasn't any suitable samples. And by analogy with other sites like Woodhenge, for example, it's quite probable that the ditch itself was later than the timber monument itself. So that was the last thing that happened on the site. Here you can see a more recent aerial photograph of the site of Mount Pleasant. You can just about make out the ditches and the palisade inside. And as you can see, the site is pretty much largely destroyed by modern agriculture. But that destruction isn't anything new. We know that parts of the palisade, the timber enclosure, were burnt down relatively shortly after it was built. And the Site 4 also seems to have been dismantled. So as I said, there are some standing stones that form part of that monument. And it seems that they were dismantled and broken up, and there's a layer within the ditch surrounding the site of all this broken sarsen and lots of burning. It seems to suggest that the site was dismantled and broken up. And the dating from that layer suggests that was done in the early Bronze Age. So quite soon afterwards, in the kind of very earliest part of the early Bronze Age, the Chalcolithic or the Beaker period. But there's an event happening there where people are coming and dismantling that monument and destroying it, which is really interesting because, of course, at this time, just after 2500 BC, you've got the first people coming to Britain and Ireland from the continent. You've got new incomers coming. DNA evidence and stable isotope work is showing us that at least small numbers of people were coming across from the continent at that time, and they were bringing with them new metals, new beaker pottery, new ways of burying the dead, and probably new religious beliefs, and new languages, etc. So, is that sign at Site 4 a sense of a bit of conflict? Is this a monument that's being destroyed by people coming into the area? We don't know. It's an interesting point to speculate about. This is a really interesting period of prehistory, and we're just beginning by constructing these really detailed chronologies to be able to pick apart what is happening socially and more widely at that time. Now, the monument complex at Dorchester is not that well known. There's not that much of it to see above ground. Mulberry Rings is still an extant monument, and you can go and visit it. But much of it is underneath the Roman and later town. This is a mural that's on the side of the Waitrose, showing you the construction of Greyhound Yard, that big timber enclosure in the middle of the town. And if you go down to the basement of Waitrose, you can see in the car park the red circles on the floor that show you the position of those post holes. But generally, it's not really a monument complex that's well known. And that's partly because the monuments were built of earth and timber rather than stone. And that means that they haven't survived as well. They haven't survived, like, for example, Avebury or Stonehenge. And so this is a monument complex that's been a bit forgotten, really. But my PhD research is also producing chronologies for the other major Neolithic monuments in this complex. So by the end of the work, we will have a really, really good detailed chronology for the whole complex, and showing how it emerged and developed over the Neolithic. So there's much more work to come, so it's quite exciting. Just to go back to Mount Pleasant, it's a henge enclosure, a mega-henge, and there are a number of these earthwork mega-henges in southern Britain, shown here in blue. But they're actually part of a kind of wider trend or tradition of building really large enclosures at this time of either earth or timber. And it seems that in southern Britain, there's a preference for building big earthwork monuments, but elsewhere, timber is much more the norm. And these are often or almost always located near rivers, and they often enclose other smaller monuments, so stone circles or timber structures, burial sites, all kinds of other things. And it seems that they are places that people are gathering, in sometimes feasting, places where people are coming together, perhaps. So this is a really interesting kind of type of monument. And these are monuments that have enormous amounts of human effort and digging out ditches, cutting down trees. These are big, big investments of time and energy. They're not quite so well known as things like the stone circles, but they're equally as draining of time and energy and equally obviously important to the Neolithic people that built them. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I'd just like to say thanks to my funders, the HRC and Historic England, who funded the radiocarbon dating, to Pete for his help in all aspects of the radiocarbon analysis, to the original excavators of these sites who kept amazingly meticulous records and published them, and they're all in the archive at Dorset County Museum, and to the museum for so carefully looking after this archive and giving us permission to sample. If you'd like to find out more, this work has been published in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society, and you can go and read all of the juicy details about the dates and the samples and more than I've been able to present today. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening.